This is Professor Tatum here to keep it going with the Gilded Age for History 1302. Here we are looking at the second part of industrialization and its discontents. Nice little play on Sigmund Freud there. In our last lecture, we looked at the rise of industrial capitalism and the rise of big business, looking primarily at who was involved with the rise of big business, what types of tactics they were using, and the role that government played in the rise of big business. It's really kind of complicated, that notion of government being hands off in the rise of industrial capitalism. In this lecture, we'll be focusing on the experiences of American workers in this same period. As usual, we will look at a little context, then we'll look at what work was like for people working in industrial jobs in the Gilded Age. Then we'll look at home life. Then we'll look at how workers began to organize into unions and what that looked like. And then we'll look at what was going on with agricultural workers, farmers in the same period, and how they tried to organize politically to solve their problems and how that turned out. So we need to remember going into this lecture that there was extensive government corruption throughout the Gilded Age at all levels of government. Saw examples like the Whiskey Ring, Credit Mobilier, Tweed Ring. And through all of these examples, we can see that this corruption was occurring across party lines from both Democrats and Republicans, and that it was occurring at all levels of government. We also need to remember things like scientific management that were taken off during this industrial revolution of the Gilded Age that had goals like efficiency and increasing productivity and decreasing costs at any costs. Remember, this often involved things like replacing skilled labor with unskilled labor as much as possible and replacing workers as much as possible with machinery. Overall, this effort of deskilling labor was very difficult on a lot of workers. Remember that this metaphor of a gilded age refers to Mark Twain's play on words for the saying a bird in a gilded cage. A bird in a gilded cage, remember, refers to a bird that's in a cage that looks real nice and shiny. It looks like maybe it's made of gold or something of the like, but if you scratch at the surface, you'll see it's really just some cheap plastic or brass or something not very valuable. And regardless of how nice the cage looks, the bird is in the cage. And remember, this is Mark Twain saying that this is a metaphor for the American people during this period, right? That they are largely constricted, yet things on the outside look like they're doing well. Business is booming. It looks like it's a great innovative period, but really people were struggling. And we've seen some pushback to that to some extent from Rebecca Edwards. She does not deny that some people were living in these kinds of conditions. She just suggested there was legitimate optimism and new spirits that people were going through in this period, in addition to, in many ways, facing these kinds of restrictions that are very clearly part of the Gilded Age. And what I want us to be considering throughout this lecture is how accurately does this metaphor of the Gilded Age describe the experiences that we're going to see of American workers in this period. We're just looking at workers here. We're not talking about business. We're not talking about people acting as consumers, though the workers very clearly sometimes probably were consumers. We're looking at the experience of labor in this period, considering that perspective of people in the industrial workplace and even in the agricultural workplace for that matter in this period. How accurate is that metaphor of a gilded age, things not being quite as nice as they look and actually being very restricting? So, considering the demographics of workers in the Gilded Age, there were many workers who were immigrants. A lot of them coming from places that were not traditionally places that people would come to the United States from. So, there were big booms by the late 1800s of people from Asia, as we saw by the later years of the 1800s. There were restrictions put in place, making that difficult for a lot of Asian people, especially those of Chinese descent. But there were also people coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, okay, places like Poland, Russia, Italy, a lot of Jewish people coming to the United States, really in larger numbers than ever before. And businesses would send labor recruiters out to the docks in cities like Ellis Island and Angel Island to recruit these workers and try to lure them into the towns where they would have work. And they'd promise them all these great things, say that they're going to have such a great work experience. And most of the time, it was a total load of, excuse me. A lot of these people found themselves living in company towns where they have to live, buy, sleep, and work all under their employer, right? Others worked in factories that we'll see had some very questionable conditions. But these immigrant workers were typically paid less than white Anglo Saxon, Protestant, kind of cookie cutter mold American workers. And again, it's not that these people were wanting to work for that wage, that they were such pathetic people that that's all they were willing to work for. It's really more that employers were finding ways to justify paying them less. But regardless, immigrants were being typically paid less than other workers. So many people did begin to see them as unfair competition in the workplace. All right. And that did unfortunately result in a good deal of discrimination against them. We saw a clear example of that with the Chinese in the West Coast. You'll have similar types of prejudice and discrimination being carried out against people of all different types of national backgrounds coming into the U.S. in this period as well. There were also a lot of women and children, especially in industrial jobs. Again, they were paid less than men. Justification there by employers was kind of based on stereotypical views of the American family in this period. There was an expectation that families were made up of a man who was the head of the household. He was the primary breadwinner. Whereas women and children, any work that they may be doing and any income they may be receiving is just a little extra. Okay. It's just supplemental to the main supply that the man's already bringing home. So they didn't really need to be paid as much because there's already somebody else there taking care of them. They're not really necessarily trying to feed themselves. They're just adding a little extra something to the table. As it turned out, not only is that a very ridiculous reason to pay somebody less, but furthermore, many of these children were orphans and many of the women were unmarried. So that logic really didn't make any sense, especially when male workers were in some cases being replaced by women and children. How are you going to expect men to be earning and providing for their families if you're kicking them out of the workplace to replace them for cheaper labor? Children also were ideal in factories because they have little hands, little fingers that can reach into machines if something gets stuck or if there's any kind of damage to the machine, and they can get it going again. And unfortunately, a lot of little hands and little fingers were lost in these industrial factories. So remember, there's this big emphasis also in descaling labor. Remember that descaling labor is a key aspect of work that's impacting a lot of workers here in the Gilded Age, and it has had long-lasting impacts that I think a lot of us feel even in the 21st century. Remember, a couple reasons businesses wanted to deskill labor. Uh, One is that having less skill meant they could justify paying people lower wages. If somebody's just hammering something down or screwing something on all day long, it doesn't take a whole lot of skill. You don't need to necessarily pay them a whole lot to be doing those repetitive tasks, right? Whereas if somebody's building whatever product they're working on here from start to finish, you're gonna probably want to pay him a little more. And by that standard, having somebody who screws something on all day or hammers something all day, that person can be easily replaced, right? You can easily bring somebody in, train them in a short amount of time to pick up on this task. From there, it's just a matter of keeping them efficient, keeping them fast, keeping them on task. Um, Whereas if you have a skilled artisan who is building something from start to finish and has a craft and a product, that's very difficult to replace. All right. So if that skilled artisan decides that they want higher pay for their craft, or if they want to work shorter hours, or if they want a lunch break, God forbid, in the middle of the day, something like that, the person who they're working for needs to kind of be willing to meet some of those demands. Whereas one of these guys tells his corporate manager, or if he ever sees his actual boss, if he tells them, hey, I think I've been working here for a while. I think maybe it'd be fair for me to get a little raise. And the boss doesn't want to give him a raise. He can simply say, okay, why don't you raise your butt up out of here and get out the door because you're fired, and then replace him pretty easily with someone else, train him how to do that task, right? Now, the main thing I want us to get out of this is the impact it had on workers, which is it made work become very meaningless. You saw in the Modern Times clip, this man essentially became part of the machine, right? He just gets so programmed to be that worker doing his duty, right? But there's really no sense of fulfillment. This seems to have had a pretty dramatic impact on the way a lot of us look at work in the 21st century now, right? We see it as something you suck up, you do, you earn some money, you deal with it, you go do it again the next day. It's a means to an end, it pays the bills, right? Um, and that can become very tedious, very meaningless, right? A lot of people eventually burn out with their jobs because they don't see much of a sense of meaning in what they're doing. Then again, in the 21st century, some of us have the problem that I do, where I absolutely love what I do, and I put my all into it, but it does not pay the bills. Hashtag broke folk. Anyway, moving on. And as I suggested a minute ago, looking at the children, there were very dangerous working conditions in a lot of industrial jobs. All right, there were very limited federal regulations, people being overworked with little rest, and operating dangerous machinery. And this did result in a lot of injuries, like this poor guy here with his arm stuck in this machine. I couldn't see a way that you could possibly get out of that without having to have your arm amputated. There were also frequent workplace fires, and sometimes factory owners would lock doors to keep union organizers out of their factories, and that would just make workplace fires get extremely out of hand, right, and be very devastating, especially with all this dangerous machinery. That if it catches fires, that's really not going to be good. And we'll see a very clear example of this at the start of our next unit. Right, so very clearly, the Industrial Revolution going on throughout the Gilded Age isn't really much of a positive revolution for workers, right? They're having to face things like de-skilled labor, skilled labor is getting pushed out of the workplace or having to take on more menial tasks, a decrease in the meaning of work, low pay, dangerous conditions, resentment between different demographics of workers because employers are paying certain demographics of workers less than others. Pretty tough time in the workplace. But you might imagine, maybe they at least get to suck up this hard work day, go home, and enjoy their home life. Well, while I'm sure many of them tried and did what they could, for the average industrial worker, home life really wasn't much better. So let's examine the average home life for industrial workers during the Gilded Age. Most industrial workers in urban areas lived in tenement housing. All right, so tenements were very high-rise apartment buildings that would go up several feet high, so you could stack a whole lot of them together. Very cost efficient, perhaps scientific management at play there, even in creating living conditions for people. And here you had families living in these small, cramped little rooms. Okay, so here's a floor plan for these tenements. And each of these little rooms here, right? You got a 9 by 10, 11 by 14. That would be where the family would live, all right? Not this whole block, not this whole block. The little squares are the rooms where people would live. Then they would have communal spaces where they would share certain things, all right? You can see here's a courtyard, a communal like eating space or something like that on each floor. And another thing that was shared communally among tenement residents were bathrooms, all right? There's one bathroom usually on each floor. Not only can I not imagine how bad that would smell having to share a bathroom with a whole floor of people. Ooh, I mean, this just enough sometimes in the bathrooms of the universities will just about take a full grown man down. But a bathroom full of people, families of all ages, that's the least of their worries, though. Imagine if somebody goes into that bathroom, the whole floor is sharing, and they're coughing all over their hands and then putting their hands all over the faucets and the toilet and everything else, everybody in that building is going to get sick. All right. Furthermore, to keep things lit and to keep warm, people would have to light kerosene lamps or coal stoves. And we know that the light bulb was taking off throughout the Gilded Age, but it wasn't made immediately cheap and accessible to everybody right away. And a lot of tenements weren't interested in going through a full renovation to get lighting installed in their tenements. So people would have to resort to using things like kerosene lamps. Again, coal was used for heating and for cooking. And you got to imagine being in those small spaces of tenements, breathing in that burning kerosene and coal for so long over a period of time is very bad for one's health. All right, so all kinds of very unsanitary conditions and health concerns as well going on in this tenement housing. So not only is work not pleasant for industrial workers, their home life seems pretty shitty as well. See what I did there? The one bathroom. Sorry, had to. So here's a real image of a group of immigrant workers packed into a tenement. I show this picture to my classes every semester, right? And we see these workers are just all packed in here, trying to keep warm under those blankets. They're getting all close to each other to try to keep warm because it's so cold in there. They probably can't afford to keep coal lit for too long to keep warm, so they're doing what they can to stay warm. And every time I look at this picture, I always can't help but wonder, what the hell is this over in the corner here, top right corner? Uh, I don't know for sure, but my theory is that the photographer was trying to make a statement here. And he was trying to show us that these conditions that these poor immigrant workers were living in were straight balls. And how was all this justified? Okay, very clearly, there's large populations of people in large urban cities who are living in conditions like this. How is this justified? Through things like social Darwinism. This idea that these people were just unfit, they were lacking some characteristics, and therefore this is the best they can hope for. Whereas it's kind of their duty to do the best they can here. Maybe eventually they can adopt some of the traits by trying to earn their place in this guy's shoes. All right, so to push back against these harsh conditions, a lot of workers began forming labor unions. Now, I know a lot of times in certain parts of the country, including Texas, in the 21st century, labor union kind of can sound like a dirty word. And while labor unions have been used for some sketchy things and have unfortunately been, in many cases, corrupted by organized crime and things like that, I think there's a big misunderstanding of what labor unions truly are and what they really do. So what a labor union really is a collective organization of workers, and workers within the union all pay dues, all right? They pay fees to be a part of the union, and those fees are used as collective funds to help take care of workers and help provide better services for workers. And they can also work collectively to push for things like better hours, better pay, safety regulations, insurance for workers, all kinds of different concessions that can help improve the quality of work for workers themselves. All right. An effective tool that labor unions can use to push for some of these concessions are strikes. So, to really understand what a strike is, it's when workers, usually workers from a particular industry, collectively refuse to work or serve an industry until demands are met. Strikes are usually accompanied by different types of demonstrations, marches, boycotts, in a lot of cases, also picketing the businesses that they're striking against to try to halt their business and put pressure on them until they're willing to meet the workers' demands or at least sit down and negotiate. So, for example, you saw during the Pullman strike, the striking workers also did things like block trains and occupy trains to slow down the business of the Pullman Railroad Card Company to put pressure on them so that they'll be more likely to want to bring this strike to an end and be willing to hear out what the workers have to say. So there's two different types of unions I want us to be familiar with that were very prominent during the Gilded Age. Every semester I go over this and present both types of unions. And every semester since the first that I taught this class, I go over this whole spiel I'm giving right here, right now. Yet still, for whatever reason, there's always a big chunk of students who decide to go write about this topic. And when it comes time to describe the different types of labor unions that were prominent in this period, they'll just write about the first one here. No, I'm giving you both types to put them into conversation because I want you to see the difference, all right? But the first type of union we're looking at here are industrial unions. These are unions that included both skilled and unskilled workers. Best example we can see of this type of union during the Gilded Age were the Knights of Labor. So the Knights of Labor was a union led by an individual named Terence Powderly, who advocated very large unions because larger unions meant more effective strikes, right? If you have a bunch of people working together going on strike, that's going to put a lot more pressure on business. And that's going to be a lot more effective for those unskilled workers, because remember, unskilled workers are very easily replaceable. So if just a handful of unskilled workers decides they're going to go on strike, they're probably going to be replaced and their strike's not going to be very effective. But if you have all these members of this large labor union going on strike together, the employers are going to be a lot more likely to take that strike seriously and want to bring it to a close and try to hear out what the workers are at least trying to demand. Furthermore, if you have that many people involved in the union, that's more people putting collective funds into the union through their membership dues, and that means that more people can afford to be paid during the time to strike. All right. So to try to build this large union, the Knights of Labor were eventually open to people of all races, as well as to migrant workers. I mean, they were viewed as a very radical labor union. And what kinds of concessions were they calling for that were so radical? Well, things like 8-hour workday, federal minimum wage, and bringing an end to child labor. So radical, I know. Big industrial unions like the Knights of Labor that included skilled and unskilled workers and were calling for these long-term reforms like 8-hour workday and an end to child labor and things like that had their reputation severely tarnished during the Gilded Age by an event known as the Haymarket Bombing.
By the 1880s, the United States was going through major political, social, and economic changes. Industry was growing in scale, and innovations in manufacturing were leading to the production of more goods and services. Factories needed workers, and more workers crowded in the cities, causing conflicts between businesses and workers within these industrial centers. One of these cities was Chicago, home to McCormick Harvester Works. For years, the McCormick family had been locked in a battle with the heavily Irish faction of the factory's workers who were in a union and would often strike over wage cuts. Despite efforts to break union activity at the McCormicks only succeeded in driving many of the factory's disaffected workers to join outside labor unions. On May 1st, 1886, Chicago unions were among those participating in a general strike to limit the workday to 8 hours, in an age where working 10 or more hours a day was commonplace. 2 days later, violence erupted between union and non-union workers at the McCormick factory after union workers discovered those who crossed the picket line had been given the 8-hour workday. During the skirmish, the police intervened, leaving 2 workers dead and others wounded.
Okay, so that's kind of the context. There had been this dispute between striking workers and police. Some of these workers were killed. Now we're looking into the actual demonstration that was held at Haymarket Square.
On May 4th, a mass meeting was scheduled in Chicago's Haymarket Square, a bustling commercial area, to protest the police brutality and the shootings that occurred outside the McCormick factory. Labor activists August Spies and Samuel Fielden, along with the political journalist Albert Parsons, were among those who gave speeches. At around 10:30 that evening, the police demanded that the meeting disperse. In the moments that followed, an unknown person threw a dynamite bomb into the crowd. Many were injured and a policeman was killed. The police retaliated. Shots were fired. Protesters were struck with clubs. By the time the crowd had dispersed minutes later, 73 policemen had been wounded. 6 of them died from injuries. 4 civilians were killed and at least 12 others were wounded. Although the meeting had been peaceful until the explosion, the public blamed the riot on the organized labor movement and on anarchists and socialists. Because both of these groups were largely made up of immigrants, it added to a fear that foreign ideas threatened American values. After an intensive investigation, 8 men were arrested, including Spies, Fielden, and Parsons, and tried for inciting the Haymarket riot. After a spectacular trial, where it was revealed that some of the men indicted did not even attend the meeting, and it could not be proven which, if any, of the men had built or set off the bomb, all 8 were found guilty and convicted. 4 were executed. In the wake of the Haymarket riots, the labor movement suffered serious setbacks. Membership rapidly dwindled across the country, and for years, anti-union sentiment swept the nation. This event would serve as an example of the powerful tensions between business and workers in the industrial age.
We need to keep in mind that industrial unions like the Knights had a strong presence and a strong support for the demonstrators here at Haymarket Square. So even though they didn't have anything to do necessarily with the violence that erupted or with the bomb that was launched that started the violence, they got kind of tied into this. And newspapers, largely at the influence of big business tycoons, portrayed this event as being a result of these dangerous anarchists and union leaders coming together and causing this kind of mayhem where there's bombs going off in the street and police firing into crowds and policemen and civilians being killed. All really got blown out of proportion. Overall, the Haymarket bombing is pretty significant because it led to tarnished reputations for industrial unions like the Knights of Labor, and it also led to further crackdowns on other industrial unions around the country. All right, but the other type of labor union that was prominent in the Gilded Age that I want us to be familiar with was craft unions. So, craft unions welcomed only skilled workers into their union. So, skilled workers, we need to understand, have a very different experience, a very different struggle they feel in many cases than unskilled workers during this period. And while there's very clearly during the Gilded Age a wedge being driven between labor and business, and furthermore, there's a wedge being driven between the haves and have-nots, we can see there's almost just as prominent of a wedge being driven between skilled workers and unskilled workers, all right? As skilled workers are feeling that they have their own unique struggle that in a way pits them against unskilled workers in many cases. So the best example I can provide here of a craft union that was prominent during the Gilded Age would be the American Federation of Labor. So this union was led by an individual named Samuel Gompers, who advocated what he called bread and butter unionism, meaning he wanted to just get down to the basics. He wasn't interested in long-term reform the way that groups like the Knights were. He wanted to just take care of the immediate issues that workers were dealing with. These types of unions use strikes more as a last resort, and they tried to settle as much as possible through negotiations between union leaders and employers. And they, instead of making these big demands and pushes for long term reforms, tried to make gradual concessions. All right, so for example, say they were wanting really to push for a $2 raise. Instead of going on strike and saying, we demand a $2 raise and we will not come back to work until you give us that $2 raise by picketing your business, they would instead say, let's have some of our union leaders go sit down with the employers and have them reasonably negotiate by saying, look, times are getting tough. I think we can all agree on that. Our union has been working very hard, doing the best we can to provide you the best work that we can and help you earn money. So do you think you could maybe see to it to help give us a 50-cent raise, right? And then they could maybe make some kind of agreement there. All right. Then a few months later, they can sit down again and say, all right, we want another 50-cent raise and another until they get that $2 raise they were pushing for. Right. So much more gradual, using negotiation as much as possible rather than this large scale strikes. And a big reason for that is because they have less members of their unions, right? They're only accepting skilled workers. So their strikes would not be nearly as effective as those by the large industrial unions like the Knights of Labor. Big difference I want you to see between these types of unions. I mean, there's a lot of little things going on, but primary difference is industrial unions like the Knights of Labor accepted skilled and unskilled workers, while craft unions accepted exclusively skilled workers. So that gives us a pretty good overview of the struggles of workers in industrial America during the Gilded Age and how they began calling for reform through organization of labor unions. Now I want to look into the experiences of agricultural workers who are having their own struggles during the Gilded Age and seeing how they tried to organize politically to push for some reform on their end. So by the late 1800s, farmers were facing some harsh economic conditions, and this was largely a result of overproduction So I am no economic expert by any means, so I want to keep this as simple as possible. If you have too much of a product, it's going to lose its value. Right? So value comes with scarcity. Think about any big hot product on the market. I like to use game systems or video games as an example. If a new game system or a new game comes out, it's the big hot thing. Everybody wants this thing, and it has a real high price tag on it. But over time, as more and more people start buying this thing, next thing you know, your neighbor has it, your brother has it. It's kind of lost its appeal because it's so common, and then it starts to lose its value. And you'll notice that gradually the price of that game system or video game or whatever the product may be will gradually decrease, right? Because they can't afford to sell it for as much as they could when it was scarce. So take that principle and apply it here to the crops that these farmers were growing. If there's farmers all around the country with too many crops, those crops are going to start to lose their value. And if there's lower value, that means they can only sell them for lower prices, leaving them in tremendous debt. But when they started falling into that debt, the best way that farmers know how to get out of debt in this period is by selling their crops. So they would start growing more crops, but that would just feed further into this overproduction. Right? So there's just this big cycle of continuing to produce to try to sell, but the more they try to sell, the more in debt they found themselves. Then this was all further complicated by things like bank loans that some of them were taking out, as well as rates charged by railroad companies to ship their crops to the market. So there were extensive monopolies and trusts of just a few railroad companies who basically dominated the industry. And if farmers are living out in the west somewhere, out kind of in the middle of nowhere, growing their crops, and there's only one railroad company that controls the railroad cars that ride through there, well, then they can charge whatever rates they want for the farmers to have to ship those crops into town. And since they don't have any competition and they don't have to try to lower their prices to beat the competition, they were charging extremely high rates for farmers to ship their products back into market to sell them. So between these loans that they're taking out, getting them into debt, and this overproduction, and the tremendous railroad rates they're having to keep up with, farmers began to feel pretty hopeless by the late 1800s. And this tremendous hopelessness had some farmers beginning to form co-ops, meaning cooperative groups that would try to work together, do things like share seeds, share tools, try to cooperate. And eventually, some of these co-ops decided to form their own political party, known as the Populist Party, also known as the People's Party. Moving forward, if I use either of those terms, I'm talking about the same thing here. Okay, the party that farmers created to try to overcome some of these hardships they were facing during the Gilded Age. In this party, the Populist Party saw the Democratic and Republican Party as too corrupt, okay, to work within. That's why they formed their own political party, because they were not wanting to work within these two parties who they thought were too friendly with big business and not going to properly represent them. Right? That's a kind of key aspect of the Populist Party is they did not trust the Democratic or Republican Party to represent their interests, so they formed their own party outside of the two-party system. Okay, they're wanting to work outside of the two-party system. Keep that in mind. But they began to eventually expand their scope beyond just agricultural workers, and they started advocating for all producing classes, meaning industrial workers as well as farmers. And they were basically seeking for the federal government to take action directly on behalf of the people, especially workers. They were looking for reform, but not for handouts. They were wanting to create situations where there could be more equal opportunity for people like farmers and industrial workers to make it out there, to not be falling further and further into debt, and to not continuously be at the mercy of the same monopolies and trusts who dominated certain aspects of the economy. So the populists really spelled out their vision and their goals in a document known as the Omaha Platform. And let's go ahead and look at some of these core beliefs that they had. Again, they believed that government corruption had grown out of hand and that both the Democratic and Republican Party were guilty of this corruption. They believed that government had shown too much favoritism to business and that they had allowed other Americans, such as farmers and industrial workers, to suffer at the expense of taking too much care of business. And that certainly influenced their goals. In the Omaha platform, they called for things like a graduated income tax, meaning a type of income tax where those earning the most would be taxed the highest, and those earning the least would be taxed the lowest, and everywhere in between. And the goal here was to make taxes lower for farmers and industrial workers and those people who were already struggling, and that'd be one less economic burden on them. They also wanted the federal government to take ownership of railroads. They were hoping that they could have more influence over the federal government than they did over the railroad companies to charge more fair rates. They were hoping that if they had their political party in office, or if they could at least use things like voting and lobbying to sway the federal government, they'd have a better chance of having lower railroad rates to ship their products into market. And they also called in the Omaha platform for the rights of laborers to form unions. This was clearly an effort to try to appease industrial workers and get their support in the ballot box as well. They also called for direct election of senators. So up to this point, senators had been selected by state representatives, but they wanted the people, the common citizens of the United States, to be able to directly elect their senators. And their goal here was to try to bring government closer to the people and to have this other body of government here, the Senate, more accountable to the people. And they were hoping that if they're trying to appease the people, they'd be less likely to participate in political corruption. As we've seen, this perhaps has reduced the level of political corruption somewhat here and there, but it has by no means eliminated. Kind of most complicated of the things they called for in the Omaha platform was the sub treasury plan. I always say think of it somewhat like a pawn shop between farmers and the government. All right, so the government are the pawnbrokers, the farmers are the customers. So basically, they're wanting to have government-owned warehouses around the country where farmers can store their crops when they have too many crops. All right. So on one hand, that would help reduce overproduction because they're getting some of their crops off of the market, but they're also not having to waste those crops. Okay, they're being stored, they're being cared for, so that during seasons where maybe it's real rainy or real cold, they can go pull some of those crops out of the warehouse and sell those. And in exchange for the federal government holding those crops, they would give a cash loan to farmers as they were holding their crops. And if farmers ended up in a situation where they were not able to pay back their loan, well, then the federal government had those crops as collateral and they could just sell the crops to make up for the money they had lost. Very similar to like a pawn shop. It's the best thing I can think of there. And one final key issue that the populace called for in the Omaha platform was this idea of bimetallism. So bimetallism, pretty simple, buy metal, two metals. So at this time, the U.S. was on what was called the gold standard, meaning that every dollar bill was worth a certain amount of gold. All right. And gold is very scarce. And as I suggested earlier, scarcity leads to value, right? So that meant that money was very hard to come by because there's only so much gold out there. If money is representing gold, there's only so much money out there. So what farmers wanted to do was add silver to the economy as well. They wanted every dollar to be worth a certain amount of both gold and silver so that there would be a little more money out in circulation. And that would decrease the value of money just enough to make it a little easier for farmers to pay off their debts. Now, we've seen in more recent times, if you get too much money out in the economy, you end up with hyperinflation, and that leads to a whole different set of problems that we're all trying to figure out now. But in this case, farmers are just wanting to get a little more flexible money supply out in the economy by adding silver to the economy through this idea of bimetallism. So the populace really had their big attempt at getting political clout in the presidential election of 1896. They had tried to have a candidate run for president in 1892. He lost, but he had won just enough votes that the populace realized maybe they had a chance if they just pulled some more support behind them. So they tried again in 1896. And in the 1896 election, the populace nominated as their candidate a Democrat, a guy named William Jennings Bryan. Right? They nominated him because he was a firm advocate of bimetallism. He made a famous speech known as the Cross of Gold speech, where he suggested that mankind had been nailed to a cross of gold, making some religious references there to try to sway his audience. And it was very much a critique of the gold standard and the promotion of bimetallism, which was a key goal of the populists. But we got to remember, the populists also had a very prominent goal of working outside of the two-party system. Right? They thought the Republicans and Democrats were too corrupt to properly represent them. So, to a lot of the populists, simply having this Democrat represent them already marked the end of their political mission, right? They already saw it at this point that they had basically sold out by working within the two-party system. But if that didn't mark the end of the populists, the outcome of the election certainly did. So William Jennings Bryan lost the election to the Republican candidate William McKinley, largely because President McKinley was a pro-business candidate and he got a lot of support from big business in his campaign. Big business really didn't like what the populists were pushing for, but also there was other factors at play, such as William Jennings Bryan being on a lot of ballots in certain states, both as a Democrat and a populist, and that just confused the bejesus out of a lot of people. And some people saw his name on there twice and said, "This guy must be up to something shady." He wasn't. It was just a stupid move. But that plus McKinley having all the support from business led to the populists losing this election of 1896. All right, so when we look at this election of 1896, we can see that it led to the collapse of the Populist Party. All right. And it also demonstrated that the two-party system and the corporate industrial capitalism would prevail in this new post-Civil War America, right? This basically shows us a lot about what this new America that we've been watching get constructed is going to look like. All right. This shows us that this post-Civil War new modern America politically will have the Republican and Democratic Party as the primary political parties that have any real political standing. Okay. And it also shows that the type of cooperative level of capitalism that the populists were pushing for was not going to be the economy of this new modern America. It was going to be very much a pro business industrial capitalist economy. So essentially, this marked the end of the Gilded Age domestically by defining those aspects of this new modern America, right? If we're looking at the Gilded Age as this period of defining the new modern America, we're kind of seeing by this point what it's going to look like. All right, we've already seen, for example, who's going to be included and excluded. All right, groups like immigrants and minorities are going to really have to struggle to be included within this modern America. We've seen that indigenous Americans are going to be forcefully included within this modern America in ways that they may not necessarily want to. And now we're also seeing here what the economy is going to look like, as well as what the government's going to look like. So there's a lot of this ambiguity that defined the Gilded Age being cleared up by the time of this presidential election of 1896. But that's not necessarily the end of the Gilded Age as a whole. All right. There's still a whole other aspect of defining this new modern America that has not been answered. And that is, what will the United States look like on a global scale? Okay, what will their role be globally? And that's what we'll be looking at in our final lecture of this unit. Before I wrap up, I want to point out a couple things about the populists. They had some key legacies. They kind of first off marked the first split within the Democratic Party. And we'll see several of those occur throughout the 20th century. And at the end of the semester, we'll wrap up by kind of breaking all of those down. But this is the first time that there's really a split between members of the Democratic Party who, as traditionally has been the case of the Democratic Party up to this point, want to preserve a very limited role of government, while others are starting to push for a more active government. All right. So the populists definitely wanted to see more active government on behalf of workers and behalf of people. And that contrasted with these old school Redeemer style Democrats who were very skeptical of active government as a result, largely of what they had seen during Reconstruction, when active government kept Democrats in the South out of power. We're also going to see, though, that many of the goals laid out by the populists were taken on by future generations, okay? Things like direct election of senators, graduated income tax, workers' rights to form unions. These are all things that we enjoy in the 21st century that were really rooted here by the populists. Furthermore, we're going to see a lot of the issues that the populists laid out continue to be pushed for by a group of individuals known as the progressives. We'll be looking at them at the start of Unit 2. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here. Let me know if you got any questions. Over and out.